Did you ever believe that the most sacred place on earth, the home where you were raised, where you cared for a parent until their very last breath, could become the site of your deepest, most wounding betrayal? What is the precise market value of 10 years of sacrifice? Do the laws of probate value a late-night vigil more or less than a quick, cold cash sale? And what happens when the two people who share your DNA decide that you, the devoted caretaker, are nothing more than a stubborn, sentimental obstacle standing between them and a six-figure payday? Before we begin this devastating chronicle, the story of how the very walls that witnessed my father's gentle passing were used as the legal instrument to make me homeless, do me a favor. If you've ever had your selfless devotion dismissed as merely babysitting, if you believe that greed must always yield to integrity, hit that like button, share this story, and most importantly, subscribe to my channel. We document the quiet, strategic warfare waged against family greed. Now, let the counting of the cost begin. The caretaker who bought back the inheritance. Chapter 1. The Final Promise. My name is Maria. I am 45, and for the last 10 years my life was a lesson in constancy. While the world outside sped up, I stayed anchored to the slow, gentle, necessary rhythm of my father's decline. This was my choice, my duty, and my quiet form of love. The family home was the epicenter of my existence, a sprawling two-story structure nestled under a canopy of ancient protective oak trees. The scent of old wood, the creak of the floorboards, the worn patina of the banister. These weren't just details. They were my history, my sanctuary, and my proof of a life well lived in service. My older brother, Michael, the corporate climber, lived in the dizzying sprawl of Dallas. My younger sister, Claire, managed luxury retail in the electric chaos of New York. Their lives were defined by status, travel, and capital accumulation. Mine was defined by the chime of a medication alarm and the comfort of holding an aging hand. I didn't mind the contrast. Their lives were loud. Mine was a vital, life-sustaining silence. My father, bless his gentle, fading soul, understood this unspoken balance. "You deserve this place, Maria," he told me one quiet evening, his voice thin but clear, his gaze resting on me with a love so immense it felt like a benediction. "It's yours. Your life is here." It was a promise, not a legal one, but a sacred one, made with the clarity of a man nearing the finish line. When he died 6 months ago, peacefully in his sleep, the loss was immense. The house became my physical anchor against the drowning tide of grief. I told myself I still had the house. I still had the promise. But the moment Michael and Claire arrived, 2 days after the funeral, before the scent of lilies had faded, I realized I no longer had siblings. I had corporate auditors. They swept into the house with the cold, assessing efficiency of vultures, their grief seemingly replaced instantly by a focused financial hunger. Michael, in his sharp, tailored suit, wore a perpetual sneer of exhaustion from his busy life. Claire's expensive high heels clicked aggressively on the very floors we used to play marbles on. The reading of the will, an old document, hastily drafted before Dad's final illness, was the ignition point for the moral dichotomy. It stipulated that the house was to be placed in trust for the 3 children, to be sold and the proceeds divided equally should the children fail to agree on a joint use. That clause, that hook, was the legal loophole they seized upon. "Joint use? That's absurd," Michael declared instantly, waving the document dismissively. "I have my career, Claire has hers. The only logical joint use, fiscally speaking, is a sale. The market is hot. We list it immediately." I felt the blood drain from my face. I protested, appealing to the memory of our father, the emotional investment. "Dad promised me, Michael. I lived here, I cared for him. This is my home." Claire, who hadn't contributed an hour of care in a decade, offered a practiced, brittle smile that cut deeper than any shout. "Oh, Maria, we appreciate the babysitting." But legally, that time was compensated by free rent and utilities. This is an asset, not a hospice center. We need the capital. Compensated by free rent. That was their verdict on a decade of devotion. It was the dismissal that changed everything. I realized they didn't see me as a sister. They saw me as an easily manipulated squatter. My love was their free labor. My home was their seized asset. The legal battle that ensued was not a negotiation. It was a ruthless, transactional demolition. Michael and Claire pooled their resources and hired a probate shark, an aggressive lawyer who specialized in exploiting ambiguous trust language. I was left scrambling for defense, relying on a weary public defender who was hopelessly outmatched by their high-powered legal team. My desperate pleas to their better nature were met with silence or sharp legal rhetoric. "Gratitude doesn't pay capital gains taxes, Maria." The internal monologue was a continuous echo of their cruelty. They see the market value, but they don't see the memory. They see the profit margin, but they don't see the sacrifice. The motions and injunctions piled up, all aimed at proving that my continued residence constituted an unnecessary financial burden on the trust. My father's promise, made with such sincerity, was legally worthless. I was losing the fight. I was about to be turned out onto the street, homeless, having spent the last decade pouring my heart into walls that were never legally mine. The final court ruling was set for the following week. Michael was already talking to real estate agents, his voice buzzing with profit margins. But as the shame of imminent defeat reached its fever pitch, it began to curdle into a cold, absolute resolve. I stopped seeing them as siblings. I recognized them for what they were: the enemy. The house was lost, but the war was not over. If they understood money, then money would be the only language they would ever hear from me again. My hands, still raw from cleaning the house my siblings were about to sell, were ready to learn how to forge a new, devastating kind of weapon. My descent into despair was complete. The time for silent service was over. The time for the quiet, strategic reckoning was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Silent Legacy. The cold wind of betrayal was stronger than the drafts whistling through the old windows of the family home. I was done crying. The tears had dried up, replaced by a singular, intense focus, an emotional isolation I had never known. Michael and Claire had already sent the cardboard boxes. Michael had even emailed a list of discount movers. I had to pack, but I was only allowed to take what I could prove was my personal property, exempt from the estate. The ultimate irony was that the only items my siblings utterly dismissed were the pieces of furniture left by our grandmother, my father's mother, the very items I had spent 10 years polishing and protecting. Michael called them cheap antique clutter. Claire barely glanced at my grandmother's heavy, ornate oak china cabinet, muttering, "My God, it takes up so much space. Just leave it for the consignment shop." It was their final, quiet insult. They valued only the quick, liquid market assets, failing to see the deep, non-monetary value, the only value left untainted by their avarice. I began the grueling task of dismantling that heavy oak cabinet, the one I had dutifully polished every week. It was slow work. As I braced myself and tilted the massive piece away from the wall to remove the rear feet, I felt a faint, distinct shift. A small, rusty, unpainted metal box clattered free from a false bottom hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It wasn't gold or jewelry. It was an old, simple tin lunchbox, sealed shut with adhesive tape. My hands trembled as I pulled the box free. The smell of dust and ancient wood rushed out. Inside, it wasn't personal secrets, but a financial revelation. The tin contained a small green twine-bound ledger, written in my grandmother's unmistakable elegant hand, and a stack of brittle, yellowed legal documents and stock certificates. This was the antithesis of the chaotic, contestable will. This was calculated, disciplined foresight. I sat on the cold floor, leaning against the sterile wall, and began to read. My grandmother, who distrusted banks and flashy lawyers, had, in the 1970s, quietly purchased a small, seemingly insignificant parcel of remote farmland. It was far away from the cities Michael and Claire called home, in a region they would have scornfully labeled the middle of nowhere. She transferred the deed to my father years before she passed, and he maintained it silently. But the crucial part was the timing. A year before his health declined, the state government had begun construction on a massive, new interstate highway. That was the twist. The highway, detailed in the documents I found, cut directly through the desolate farmland. My father, with a wisdom I hadn't realized he possessed, refused the initial lowball offers. Instead, he secretly signed a highly lucrative long-term lease agreement with a major energy corporation for pipelines that needed to run under the land, skyrocketing its value far beyond its original purchase price. The entire transaction was handled by a small, discreet legal trust in a neighboring county, a deliberate move to keep it entirely separate from the large, greedy law firms Michael and Claire would consult. The ledger clearly showed this account was never intended for the will and was never part of the divisible estate. It was an irrevocable private trust, explicitly established for my principal caretaker, Maria Louise, who sacrificed her time and career to honor her familial obligations. I quickly flipped to the final summary page, written by my father's own hand, slightly shaky but legible, just months before his death. Maria, you never asked for anything. You deserve this. Use it to find justice. Never let kindness be penalized. The total value listed, the compounded lease payments and the highway right-of-way compensation had quietly grown to over $15 million, a sum so enormous it defied immediate comprehension. I sat in the darkness, clutching the old tin lunchbox. They were evicting me from a $500,000 home, yet I was sitting on an untouchable $15 million war chest they knew absolutely nothing about. My humiliation had led me directly to my treasure. The emotion wasn't immediate joy. It was a profound, cold fury mixed with steely determination. They wanted to play the game of greed? Now, I could not only buy the entire family home, but I could buy the legal leverage to ensure they lost everything they valued most, their money and their status. I did not waste time mourning the past or celebrating the future. My first move was absolute secrecy. I didn't contact the trust immediately. Instead, I used the last of my meager personal savings to do what Michael and Claire did. I hired a lawyer. But not my old, overworked public defender. I hired a specialized real estate and probate expert, a master strategist completely unknown to Michael's corporate circle. I had to learn the enemy's language. I had to transform my honesty into an unshakable financial weapon. As I sat in my new lawyer's office discussing asset control strategies and the formation of a necessary anonymous limited liability company, LLC, an invisible entity to purchase property without revealing my identity, my old flip phone vibrated. It was a cold, short text from Michael and Claire's shark lawyer. Maria, final eviction order signed today. You must vacate the premises by 5 p.m. Tuesday. The house will be listed Wednesday morning. Good luck. They had slammed the door shut, assuming I was trapped outside in the cold. I looked at the phone screen, then at the vast financial strategy documents spread across the lawyer's desk. I didn't reply. I just nodded to my lawyer, my eyes cold and steady. The fall was complete. The ascent had officially begun. They thought they were selling the family home. They didn't know they were about to sell it to the very caretaker they had just expelled. Chapter 3. Forging the tool. The eviction notice, delivered to my phone by an emotionless text from the lawyer who specialized in dismantling families, was the final, heavy gate slamming shut on my past. I looked at the cold, official words demanding I vacate by Tuesday, and felt nothing but the deep, satisfying pressure of the future. The time for the caretaker was over. The era of the strategist had begun. My first act was to put a physical distance between myself and the house. It was too tempting to stay in rage. Instead, I quietly moved into a small, temporary, furnished apartment, a sterile space with thin walls and no memories. This new, neutral environment became my monastery, my training ground. The money, the magnificent silent legacy left by my father and grandmother, was powerful, but raw. It was a loaded gun handed to an untrained civilian. My immediate goal wasn't to spend it, but to learn how to aim it. My new lawyer, Mr. Elias Vance, understood this immediately. He wasn't a shark. He was a craftsman. He specialized in complex trusts and asset protection, possessing a quiet, surgical precision that mirrored my grandmother's foresight. "The asset is magnificent, Maria," Mr. Vance said during our first intensive session. Completely untouchable by the will or your siblings, they looked at the house's market value and missed the land's infrastructure value. Classic avarice blindness. But to use this fund effectively, you must learn the language of your enemies. This began my self-imposed apprenticeship, my climax of effort. I traded the soft, worn comfort of my father's blanket for the sharp, unforgiving texture of corporate finance and real estate law. My days were brutal, disciplined, and utterly focused. I devoured texts on fiduciary law, trust enforcement, and property valuation. I studied the legal weaknesses Michael and Claire exploited, not to cry over them, but to wield them myself. My internal monologue turned cold, transactional. The house is not an emotional sanctuary, it is a leveraged asset. Grief is a distraction. Capital is clarity. The true purpose of my study became an anthropological exercise. I demanded every public filing related to my siblings' corporate lives: Michael's real estate holdings in Dallas, Claire's boutique franchise debt, their tax histories. I studied their financial footprints with the same meticulous devotion I once applied to my father's medication chart. What I discovered was a predictable, satisfying weakness: arrogance and over-leveraging. Michael and Claire lived opulent, public lives built on excessive debt and the assumption that the next big deal would always cover the last. They were financially loud, always showing off. Their immediate, desperate need to sell the family home wasn't about securing wealth, it was about plugging a leak in their own unstable financial ships. "They are weak, Maria," Mr. Vance confirmed, pointing to a ledger detailing Michael's overextended property portfolio. "They need the cash from the house now, they can't wait." The LLC was formed next. I named it Lumen Holdings, Latin for light. It was an opaque, unassailable legal entity registered in a different state, completely unconnected to the name Maria Louise. It was my ghost, my instrument of war, designed to purchase property without revealing its operator. My own transformation was mirrored in my appearance. I stopped wearing the soft fabrics and comfortable clothes of the caregiver. I wore simple, severe, dark clothing, my own version of armor. I cut my hair sharply. I adopted a quiet, controlled demeanor that invited no sympathy and revealed no weakness. I had transformed from a sentimental woman into an immovable force. The hardest part of the preparation was the enforced strategic silence. On Tuesday, the day of my court-mandated eviction, I stayed miles away. I instructed a moving company to retrieve the few items Michael and Claire deemed worthless: the antique furniture, the old books, the box containing the secret trust documents, the physical evidence of my new power. I received a jubilant, condescending text from Michael. House is clean. Listing on Zillow tomorrow. Thanks for finally cooperating, Maria. This was the fiscally responsible choice. His final, arrogant dismissal, thanks for finally cooperating, was the fuel I needed. He thought I was beaten. When I met with Mr. Vance later that week, I was ready to talk tactics. They will list the house tomorrow morning, I told him, placing the court-ordered eviction notice next to the Lumen Holdings Incorporation papers. How do we stop them? Mr. Vance smiled, a slight, knowing gesture that reminded me of my grandmother. We don't stop them, Maria. We let them list it. They want a quick, clean sale. We give them exactly the opposite. We use Lumen Holdings to subtly, legally, and anonymously obstruct every single qualified buyer they find. We make their asset toxic. We stretch their debt until the breaking point. The plan was cruel in its precision. We wouldn't fight them in court where they were strong. We would fight them in the marketplace where they were vulnerable. We would let them believe the house was their salvation, only to watch them frantically struggle to sell the unsellable asset. They need the cash, and they need it quickly, I summarized. We ensure the house bleeds them dry while they hold it. Exactly, Mr. Vance affirmed. When they are on the brink of foreclosure and utter financial panic, then Lumen Holdings will step in. You will buy the house, Maria, but you won't buy it from them. You will buy it at auction from the bank at a fraction of the cost, ensuring they receive nothing but the final devastating consequence of their own greed. I looked at the documents, the eviction notice, the trust fund statement, the LLC incorporation. I saw the map of my vengeance. The pain of the eviction was now just the initiation ritual. The caretaker was gone. The strategist was ready to hunt. Chapter 4: The Secrets of Michael and Claire. The eviction notice had expired and I was gone. The family home, the anchor of my last decade, was now officially listed, a gleaming, idealized image on a real estate website, ready to be devoured by the marketplace. But I wasn't watching the listing to grieve. I was watching it to hunt. My anonymity, sealed within the legal walls of Lumen Holdings, was my most powerful asset. Through Mr. Vance, I wasn't just observing the sale. I was subtly, legally contaminating it. Our initial moves were surgical and precise. Michael and Claire needed a fast, clean sale to prove their fiscally responsible choice. We made sure they got the exact opposite. Lumen Holdings didn't submit lowball offers. Instead, we directed Mr. Vance's team to submit a flurry of highly specific, entirely legitimate legal inquiries to every qualified buyer they attracted. Query regarding the historical liability of the aging septic field, as detailed in the 1998 county report. Formal request for clarification on the boundary line easement rights potentially held by the neighboring parcel. Every question was designed to do one thing: introduce doubt. In the high-stakes world of real estate, doubt equals delay, and delay equals death to a quick sale. The potential buyers weren't dealing with a flaky seller. They were dealing with the complexity of the property itself. My internal monologue was cold, almost gleeful. They wanted the house to be a clean asset. I will make it toxic. The contamination worked immediately. The real estate agent, a slick man named Mr. Thompson, began canceling open houses. The atmosphere changed from hopeful market frenzy to cautious stagnation. But obstruction was only half the battle. I needed to identify the Achilles heel, the specific, critical weakness in Michael and Claire's financial empires that the house money was intended to plug. Using the immense capital secured through the trust, I instructed Mr. Vance to perform a forensic financial dive into their public and private records, a level of scrutiny they, operating under the assumption that I was a penniless squatter, would never have anticipated. What we unearthed was predictable, yet profoundly satisfying. Arrogance built on a foundation of sand. Michael's corporate success in Dallas was entirely built on over-leveraged commercial properties. He had taken out massive short-term loans, betting everything on a quick market flip that had failed to materialize. The house money wasn't for profit. It was to cover a $700,000 balloon payment on a highly aggressive development project, due in 3 months. If he missed that deadline, his entire portfolio would trigger a devastating margin call. Claire, meanwhile, was even more unstable. Her luxury boutique empire was propped up by a series of private high-interest loans designed to keep her lavish New York lifestyle afloat. The house money was earmarked to cover a massive, overdue tax bill and prevent the sudden, embarrassing collapse of her brand, a scandal that would ruin her social status instantly. The realization was stark. They hadn't forced the sale out of greed for extra cash. They did it out of desperation for survival. The family home was their financial lifeline, and my eviction had been a calculated, necessary cruelty to save their own failing empires. "They are operating on a severe timeline, Maria," Mr. Vance summarized, pointing to the due dates. "Michael's payment is 90 days out. Claire's tax bill is 6 weeks out. Every day the house sits unsold, their financial stability evaporates." I felt no pity. I only felt the cold satisfaction of control. They had chosen to weaponize the law against family duty. Now, the consequences of their financial recklessness were in my hands. I could see their public facade through their social media posts. Claire posting about a successful sales trip, Michael boasting about a new strategic partnership. But behind the scenes, I knew the reality was one of escalating, frantic pressure on Mr. Thompson, the real estate agent. Mr. Thompson's emails, forwarded to Mr. Vance through strategic back channels, spoke volumes. "The buyers are getting nervous about the undisclosed liens. We need to address these legal questions immediately, or the deal is dead." But the only entity authorized to address those complex, legitimate legal questions was Lumen Holdings, through Mr. Vance, the very entity ensuring those questions were asked. The strategic timeline was locked in. I would continue the obstruction, squeezing them financially until they were on the brink of absolute ruin, just days before Michael's balloon payment was due. I had turned their desperation into my clock. My internal monologue settled into a quiet hum of efficiency. You wanted to exploit the family home for financial gain. Now, the family home will become the specific, single point of failure that collapses everything you built on arrogance. I wasn't attacking them personally, I was attacking their system. And by allowing their own financial mismanagement to fester under the pressure of the stalled sale, I was ensuring that the justice delivered would be perfectly legal, perfectly timed, and entirely self-inflicted. The caretaker was gone. The executioner was counting down the weeks. Chapter 5. Becoming the hunter obstruction was satisfying, but it was a waiting game. And I had learned from my enemies that waiting grants too much time for the opposition to recover. I needed to move from merely blocking their retreat to actively dismantling their front lines. I needed to stop simply contaminating the family home and start seizing their other assets. I needed to transform from the elusive prey into the calculated predator. My focus shifted entirely from the listed house to the fragile, over-leveraged core of Michael's and Claire's financial empires. The family home was their lifeline, their debt was my weapon. Michael's $700,000 balloon payment on his speculative Dallas development was the soft target. This debt, a short-term high-interest note held by a regional investment firm, represented the immediate threat to his solvency. If I could seize that note, I wouldn't just be hoping he failed. I would be holding the trigger to his complete financial ruin. The maneuver required absolute stealth. Michael, the corporate shark, would recognize any direct interest in his debt as a hostile takeover attempt and would immediately know the source had to be family. We needed to be cleaner than clean. Mr. Vance and I utilized Lumen Holdings, my anonymous LLC, and its capital from the trust to set up a secondary, untraceable investment vehicle. This new layer of separation allowed us to purchase the debt note without raising a single red flag at Michael's firm. We presented ourselves as a disinterested third-party holding company, seeking high-yield, short-term assets. The regional investment firm, seeing an opportunity to offload a slightly risky, high-value note quickly, didn't hesitate. The transaction was swift and silent. Within a week, the $700,000 note, Michael's Achilles heel, his ticking time bomb, was legally owned by my anonymous corporation. The moment Mr. Vance confirmed the transfer, the feeling was exhilarating and terrifying. I didn't own the house yet, but I owned Michael. I had purchased his impending failure. My internal monologue was a quiet, cold chant of power. He saw me as a squatter. I now own his foundation. I purchased his arrogance. Meanwhile, the reports from the real estate agent, Mr. Thompson, continued to arrive, forwarded through our network. The desperation was palpable. The potential buyer has withdrawn due to the unresolved easement issues. The client needs a clean title. We have lost 3 weeks, Michael. We need to lower the price or resolve the outstanding legal queries immediately. Michael, oblivious that the legal queries were coming from my team and the debt was now owned by me, reacted with predictable arrogance. He pressured Thompson, threatening to switch agents, convinced that the market was against him, not his own fate. The strategy now shifted from holding the note to tightening the noose. I instructed Mr. Vance to issue the first official communication regarding the acquired debt. It was a formal, sterile letter sent directly to Michael's legal team, informing them that the ownership of the $700,000 note had changed hands. The letter contained no demands, only a legal notice of the transfer. The second letter, however, delivered the blow. Using an obscure clause in the original loan documents, a clause Michael himself, in his haste, had likely signed without reading, Lumen Holdings formally invoked a mandatory prepayment review, dramatically shortening the note's term. His original deadline was 90 days. The new deadline was 30 days. This was the final devastating move of the twist-change strategy. The house was stalled, the price dropping, and now his urgent need for cash was accelerated from 3 months to 30 days. The money from the family home went from being necessary for his survival to being absolutely critical for his immediate avoidance of ruin. I imagine the scene in Michael's Dallas office, the moment his lawyers realized that his carefully constructed financial facade had been compromised by a faceless entity, and that his balloon payment was due next month, not next quarter. Panic would set in. I had done more than just buy back the house. I had bought the ability to watch Michael's empire crumble from the inside out, on a timeline of my choosing. Claire, meanwhile, was collateral damage. Her tax bill was still due, and now Michael, desperate for any liquidity, was pressuring her to agree to further price reductions on the house, a move that would guarantee her own financial ruin. Their greed, which had bound them together to exploit me, was now driving them to destroy each other. The final element of the strategy was simple: wait for the foreclosure. I instructed Mr. Vance to maintain the legal obstruction on the house sale and to refuse any communication regarding the debt note until Michael was within days of defaulting. I wanted them to experience the sheer paralyzing terror of utter helplessness, the exact feeling they had inflicted on me when I was packing my few belongings. I was no longer the sentimental caretaker. I was the financial hunter, cold, patient, and prepared to watch my siblings' noisy, arrogant world dissolve into the silence of their own self-inflicted despair. The reckoning was perfectly positioned. The family home would soon be mine. Chapter 6. The Debt Web Closes. I had launched the weapon. Now I watched the impact. The letter from Lumen Holdings, The anonymous notice shortening Michael's crucial $700,000 balloon payment deadline from 90 days to 30 was designed to induce immediate cold panic. But initially, Michael and Claire reacted with predictable arrogance. They dismissed the new debt owner as an aggressive, opportunistic firm. They believed the family home, their golden parachute, would sell quickly, rendering the shortened deadline irrelevant. 30 days? Fine. I could almost hear Michael sneering to Claire. Thompson just needs to close one of those offers. We sell the house, pay the note, and profit. The Raiders won't get a cent of penalty. But the house wasn't selling. My systematic obstruction, executed meticulously by Mr. Vance's team, the endless legitimate legal inquiries regarding obscure historical liens and easement rights, had achieved the perfect effect. The title wasn't technically flawed, but it was toxic. Every qualified buyer who approached the table saw the stack of legal questions from Lumen Holdings and instantly withdrew, unwilling to risk a messy, protracted closing. Doubt, I learned, was the ultimate weapon against liquidity. The daily reports Mr. Vance filtered to me were maps of my siblings' spiraling desperation. Mr. Thompson, the real estate agent, was increasingly frantic. His emails to Michael went from professional updates to desperate pleas. Michael, we lost the Johnson offer. They cited the unresolved boundary queries. We must clear the title immediately, or no one will touch this property. They are terrified of future litigation. Michael's public mask began to crack. His social media boasts of corporate success grew thinner, his replies to Claire sharper. The pressure immediately fractured their fragile alliance. The house money had been their binding agent. Now, the stalled sale was their explosive charge. Internal conflict. Claire's tax bill deadline was approaching fast. She needed the cash at the original, high asking price. Michael, facing his imminent debt default, needed the cash yesterday, regardless of the price. We have to cut the price by 20%, Claire. I need liquidity. Michael must have screamed over the phone. You touch that price and my tax bill triggers penalties, Claire would have screamed back. You're the one who over-leveraged the Dallas properties. That's your problem, Michael. Their greed, the very force that had united them to evict me, was now driving them into open warfare against each other. They had no idea that the immovable obstacle preventing the sale and the impending foreclosure deadline were being orchestrated by the caretaker they had dismissed. As Michael's deadline approached, just 10 days remained, I authorized Mr. Vance to execute the final, absolute obstruction. We filed a formal, non-monetary claim of interest against the family home's title. This claim, based on the obscure conditional language of my father's old trust document, the loophole they had used against me, was a masterpiece of legal pedantry. It didn't demand money. It simply demanded that any sale had to formally prove that the joint use agreement condition had been legally and amicably settled by all parties involved before the listing. This final maneuver was a legal neutron bomb. It made the title completely unsellable to any legitimate buyer. It meant that Michael and Claire, unable to agree on the terms of the sale, had failed to resolve the condition of the trust. The house was now legally paralyzed. I remember the day the final, desperate email from Mr. Thompson arrived, addressed to all three of us. I am formally withdrawing the listing. The title is encumbered by unresolved familial disputes. No buyer will proceed. Michael's frantic phone calls to Mr. Vance began that same day, not about the house, but about the impending debt note he desperately needed to restructure. This is aggressive. Your client is clearly trying to corner the market. Michael must have raged to Vance. Tell them I need an extension. I'll pay a penalty. Anything. Mr. Vance, following my strict instruction for strategic silence, replied with cold, efficient legal boilerplate. Lumen Holdings adheres strictly to the contractual terms of the note. Payment is due in 7 days. No extension is available. The silence was deafening. The arrogance had been replaced by genuine, shattering fear. Michael Harmon, the master of corporate strategy, was trapped. The default, the 30-day accelerated deadline arrived. Michael missed the $700,000 balloon payment. Lumen Holdings, without fanfare, immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings on Michael's heavily leveraged Dallas properties, the core of his self-proclaimed empire. The financial structure he had built on risk and hubris collapsed instantly, cascading into margin calls and insolvency. Claire's tax deadline arrived just 3 days later. With the house unsellable and Michael ruined, she had nowhere to turn. She couldn't sell her boutique shares without triggering a panic. Her quiet, status-driven world dissolved into a humiliating tax seizure. I didn't rejoice. The feeling was a profound, cold vindication. They had wanted the family home to fund their reckless lives. Instead, their pursuit of the house had become the specific catalyst for their complete financial annihilation. The family home was now scheduled for a foreclosure auction by the bank that originally held the mortgage, the last pathetic financial remnant of their failed alliance. I looked at the simple, court-ordered document listing the date and time of the auction. The house was no longer theirs. It wasn't mine yet either. It was waiting, a prize to be claimed legally and morally. I had been evicted with 2 suitcases and the false promise of a home. Now I held the entire financial fate of my siblings in my hands. The climax of strategy was complete. I was ready for the final step, to buy back the house and face my ruined family one last time. Chapter 7: Where Justice Speaks. The strategic silence had done its work. Michael had defaulted on his $700,000 note, his Dallas properties collapsing into foreclosure. Claire's assets were frozen under tax liens. Their noisy empires, built on arrogance and debt, had dissolved, leaving behind only the cold, bitter reality of ruin. The family home, the subject of their avarice, was the final casualty, stripped of its market value and scheduled for a foreclosure auction. It was no longer Michael's asset, or Claire's asset. It belonged to the bank, a fate far more satisfying than simply buying it from their hands. I did not attend the auction myself. I had already learned that true power operates through proxies and legal instruments. Mr. Vance attended, bidding discreetly on behalf of Lumen Holdings. I spent that morning in my sterile apartment, reviewing the documents of my financial life, the irrevocable trust that made me wealthy, the Lumen Holdings Incorporation that made me invisible, and the court order that had made me homeless. The sense of peace was profound, achieved not through forgiveness, but through absolute surgical control. The call from Mr. Vance was brief. "It's done, Maria. We acquired the property at 40% below the original listing price. The title is clean. The house is yours." I felt a rush of validation, not victory, but the quiet confirmation of equilibrium. The house had been redeemed, legally and ethically, from the hands that polluted it with greed. The final confrontation needed to be clinical. I instructed Mr. Vance to summon Michael and Claire to his office under the pretense of finalizing the last minor accounting details of the original probate estate, a necessary evil to close the books on their disastrous alliance. I spent hours preparing for the meeting. I was no longer wearing the soft, weary fabrics of the caretaker. I wore a tailored, simple dark suit, my final suit of armor. My face was composed, my gaze steady. I had rehearsed my silence more than my words. The absence of emotion was the sharpest rebuke I could offer. When I arrived at Mr. Vance's pristine, high-rise office suite, I waited in the reception area. The office was quiet, professional, the atmosphere thick with the smell of new leather and power, a world away from the burnt coffee scent of the probate courtrooms. Michael and Claire arrived minutes later, arguing bitterly. They looked defeated, not just financially, but spiritually. Michael, once impeccably tailored, looked rumpled and haggard, his face tight with stress and unresolved anger. Claire, her expensive makeup unable to conceal the dark circles of sleepless nights, clutched an outdated designer handbag like a shield. They were consuming each other, their alliance dissolved into mutual accusation. They didn't see me until they were ushered into the small conference room. They sat down across the table from Mr. Vance, assuming the chair next to him was reserved for a junior attorney. They were still wrapped up in their own financial woes, barely sparing a glance for the composed woman already seated near the window. Me. Mr. Vance, Michael began, his voice hoarse. I assume this is about the tax liability on the— Michael, I interrupted, my voice calm and neutral, cutting through his anxiety. The tax liability is a consequence of your own actions. This meeting is about closing the estate. They both snapped their heads toward me. It was the moment of the main climax. Michael stared, confusion quickly melting into furious recognition. Maria, how did you get in here? Are you cleaning up after Vance? Claire, however, recognized the suit and the setting. Her eyes went wide with dawning horror. Wait, Michael, look at her. That's not a cleaning suit. I gave them no time to recover. I nodded to Mr. Vance, who slid a single crisp document across the table. It was the notarized deed for the family home. You came here to close the estate, I stated, my voice measured. The final asset, the family home, was sold at auction yesterday. Michael snatched the document, scanning the new ownership lines. He searched frantically for the buyer's name, a name he knew he couldn't beat. A big bank, a national firm. His finger landed on the name of the buyer, Lumen Holdings, LLC. Lumen Holdings, he spat, throwing the paper down. That damn obstructionist firm. They bought it cheap, didn't they? Who are they? Who is the principal of this opportunistic group? I leaned forward, my hands resting calmly on the table. My eyes, which he had always seen as sentimental and weak, were clear and utterly merciless. I am the principal, Michael, I confirmed. I am the owner of Lumen Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Michael and Claire were stunned into statues. The realization that the penniless squatter they had evicted was the very entity that had meticulously orchestrated their ruin, purchased their greatest asset, and driven them to financial annihilation was the ultimate devastating blow. Michael finally found his voice. A high-pitched sound of desperate betrayal. You? You had money? All this time? You let us pay the legal fees, you let us— Yes, I finished for him, my voice gaining quiet force. I had money. I had the silent legacy that you were too blinded by the house's market value to ever find. And I let you pay your legal fees because I wanted the justice to be perfectly legal and entirely self-inflicted. I then pushed a second document across the table, a copy of the Irrevocable Trust signed by our father and grandmother. You called my decade of sacrifice compensated babysitting, Claire, I said, looking directly at her shattered face. You wanted to sell the house because it was an asset. You were wrong. The true asset, the $15 million fortune from the land your greed made you ignore, was set aside years ago. It was explicitly meant for the child who stayed. The revelation was the final, total humiliation. Their attempt to seize one small asset had cost them everything, and the source of the fortune had been right under their noses. You receive nothing, I concluded, standing up to signify the end of the meeting. The house is mine, purchased legally at auction. Your debt notes, including your $700,000 balloon payment, Michael, were fully acquired by Lumen Holdings before your default. They are now worthless, but the foreclosure actions stand, as per the terms you signed. I did not offer forgiveness. I simply offered the cold, hard logic of their own greed turned against them. As I walked out, leaving them devastated, arguing over who was to blame for missing the trust document, I felt the quiet, profound weight of the redeemed house. It was no longer a sanctuary of loss, it was a foundation of justice. The final purpose of the house, however, was still ahead. And it would be a purpose that would deliver the ultimate moral rebuke. Chapter 8. The House with Meaning. I walked out of Mr. Vance's pristine office suite and into the late afternoon light, leaving Michael and Claire trapped in the wreckage of their own avarice. I did not feel the fiery, shouting triumph I had anticipated. Instead, there was a profound, quiet equilibrium, the serene feeling of a debt paid, a wound cauterized, and a balance restored to the universe. The money, the magnificent silent legacy, remained untouched, ready to secure my future. Michael and Claire were ruined, left only with the bitter truth that they had been defeated by the very family love they had mocked and tried to sell. But the most significant transaction wasn't the acquisition of wealth. It was the redemption of a promise. The family home was mine, legally purchased at auction. I waited 3 days before returning. I didn't want the air still tainted by the shock and anger of my siblings. I needed the house to breathe, to settle back into the quiet sanctity it held before their greed had violated its walls. When I finally opened the door with my own key, the key of an owner, not a caretaker, the familiar scent of old wood, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams washed over me. The house was empty. Michael and Claire, having been evicted by the bank, had taken their own few remaining possessions and fled, leaving behind only the cold, hollow space their transactional presence had created. I walked through the empty rooms, and the internal monologue was no longer one of strategy or revenge, but of final, quiet reckoning. The house is beautiful, legally mine, and completely silent. But its true value is not found in the number I paid at auction, nor in the profit Michael hoped to make. Its true value lies only in the purpose it serves. I sat in the living room, the space where I had watched my father decline, where he had made his final, unspoken promise. I had fulfilled the vengeance part of the plan, but I hadn't fulfilled the promise part. Living in the house now, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the silence of my victory, felt insufficient, even selfish. The house had witnessed the corrosive effects of greed. It needed to witness the restorative power of service. It needed to embody the true spirit of duty and care that Michael and Claire had dismissed. The final, absolute decision was made then and there. I would not live in the house. I would ensure that my inherited wealth, derived from my father's land and my grandmother's foresight, would be used to fulfill the house's highest moral potential. I summoned Mr. Vance and instructed him on the final, irrevocable move: the creation of the Alara Foundation. "The family home will not be my residence, Mr. Vance," I explained, looking out at the ancient oak trees that had witnessed my entire life. "It will be the Foundation's headquarters. I want the house renovated, not for luxury, but for utility. I want it converted into a residence and community center for the forgotten, for the vulnerable, elderly members of our community who have no caretaker and no home." This was the final, profound act of justice, the moral resolution. The house that Michael and Claire tried to exploit for raw, personal gain would now be dedicated entirely to the selfless service they had ridiculed. The space that had been used to make me homeless would now be used to shelter the truly homeless. The announcement was made quietly, through the Foundation's newly established professional channels. There was no fanfare, no public triumph, only the quiet publication of the deed transfer and the statement of the Foundation's mission. Michael and Claire received the news like a final cold slab of granite. They attempted to send furious legal demands, questioning the Foundation's legitimacy. But Mr. Vance simply responded with the sterile factual truth: Lumen Holdings, the legal owner, had the right to dispose of its asset as it saw fit. Their outrage was legally impotent. My victory was not found in their suffering, but in the complete redirection of the asset. I often returned to the house during the renovation, watching the specialized teams convert the bedrooms into accessible suites and the dining room into a communal space. The silence was now purposeful, filled with the anticipation of future care and healing. I stood on the porch one last time, looking at the familiar symmetry of the life I once knew. I hadn't just bought a house, I had bought back the meaning of family duty. My ultimate reward wasn't the millions in the bank. It was the profound realization that my father and grandmother had not only foreseen the greed, but had armed me with the means to turn that greed into generosity. They taught me that the quiet work, the work of care, of planning, of enduring, is the only work that ultimately matters. I finally walked away from the family home, not as a victim, not as a wealthy investor, but as the successful fulfiller of an inherited moral contract. I had faced the darkest side of human nature and chosen the light. The reckoning was complete, and the house had finally found its true, invaluable meaning.